In Lagos, even the strongest gates cannot keep out the whispers of buried sins. The mansion rose from the sand-packed edge of the lagoon, like a verdict the water could not appeal, its perimeter walls layered in imported stone that looked pale under the sun and darker in the rain, its perimeter lights arranged with the discipline of a commandant's medals, its steel gates heavier than necessary the way the bracelets of a queen sometimes weigh more than the wrist. And yet nothing about the place felt ornamental to the people who lived beyond those walls, because the house had been built not to be admired, but to be believed. And belief was the currency that Chief Adeyemi traded more ruthlessly than stocks or oil futures or cement, that quiet belief among politicians and police commissioners and the market kings of Lagos, that his home, like his name, could withstand siege and scandal and still remain sovereign over the traffic that bowed before his convoy each morning. The gatehouse was a block of tempered glass and polished teak, where guards in crisp navy uniforms signed their names with a flourish that grew more reverent at night. The driveway was a ribbon of granite that arched toward a fountain with bronze horses rearing against an invisible foe. And beyond that, the main house spread its wings in two asymmetrical angles, so that the front, with its pillars and balconets and shuttered windows, appeared to be offering the city a choice between confession and denial. The staff quarters, hidden behind a fan of jacaranda trees, held their own murmurs. The kitchen garden, where basil and scent leaves trembled under a sun that loved no one, gave off a clean spice that seemed almost indecent in a compound trained to smell only of polish and power. Inside, the floors were the color of deep tea, burnished by generations of maids who had learned to move like wind across water, so that their presence would not trouble the heavy draperies or the brocade chairs, or the portraits of Adeyemi men staring down the corridors with eyes that refused to concede mortality. Along those corridors, the air conditioning exhaled a constant breath that made the house feel alive, or perhaps not alive exactly, but attentive, like a congregation that will not cough while the priest speaks. And into this attentive hush came the daily choreography of the staff. The head butler, a veteran of the old colonial hotels who had perfected the art of making apologies, sound like favors. The steward with a memory for the precise angle of a teaspoon in a saucer. The gardeners performing penance over the lawn, with blades so precise the grass looked ironed. The drivers rehearsing patience in the circular drive where the chief's fleet glittered under cotton covers like patient beasts. And the guards, especially the guards who by day stood still enough to seem carved and by night walked in overlapping arcs as if tracing a spell of protection that could not afford to falter, because faltering in this house was not an error, but a sin that went on one's record in ink that did not dry. When the old housekeeper spoke of the hierarchy here, she did not use the language of management. She spoke in the grammar of tides and storms and shelter, for in the Adeyemi compound, the positions were not merely jobs, but weathers you learned to survive. And at the center of that weather, turning it, predicting it, enjoying it, stood Chief Adeyemi, the dynasty's patriarch, a man who had learned to siphon the impatience out of time and inject it into other men until they delivered what he wanted, a man who wore white as if it were armor and perfume, as if it were jurisdiction, and whose voice, even in kindness, betrayed a habit of command. He kept breakfast as a ritual of order, lunch as a theater of power, and dinner as a private court where mercy appeared on the menu but was rarely served. He loved the press when they were thirsty, the courts when they were sleepy, and the people when they remembered to be grateful. He loved his children too, in the way a collector loves his rarest pieces, not to be handled by strangers, not to be taken out when the weather is poor, not to be questioned about authenticity. The elder son, Danladi, who oversaw procurement with a smile that made contractors recheck their sums. The daughter, Ijoma, whose charitable foundation lightened the family name with photographs of ribbon cuttings and hospital wards. And the younger son, Chaike, who was neither as polished as his brother nor as admired as his sister, because he did not seem to understand that in a house like this, kindness must be rationed like medicine. It was in this house, under its disciplinarian ceilings and its corridors, that collected echoes the way mango trees collect bats, that Adaz moved each day with the patience of water smoothing a stone, a young maid whose first months of labor had drained her of the village habit of announcing her presence with laughter, and whose next years had taught her an urban silence, the kind Lagos respects when it cannot decide whether to love you or use you. She had come at 19 with a letter of recommendation from a priest and hands that had learned more from fieldwork than from books, and she had remained because the house, though demanding, was steady, and because the money she sent home bought her father's medicines and her siblings' school uniforms and a window with a mosquito net that did not sag when the rains came. The other maids admired and envied her calm. The stewards asked for her during the busiest receptions because she remembered not only where the wine glasses were kept, but which guest favored a heavier pour and which one preferred water with no ice. The drivers greeted her with a tenderness they did not display to one another. Even the head butler, who did not believe in praising the living, once placed a hand on her shoulder when she was polishing the silver and said, "The house hears you. When you work, and it likes your sound." Adao's was not beautiful in the way the city billboard taught girls to measure themselves. Her beauty did not announce, it accumulated. It had a tensile strength that revealed itself in the steadiness of her step when trays were heavy, in the quiet way her eyes examined a thing before her hands committed, in the little pauses that made her more present than the people who spoke louder. She had a face that remembered joy even on tired mornings, and the sincerity of her empathy. An outrageously expensive gift in a house that bought everything else, meant that the children of visiting relatives memorized her name before they learned the difference between the two parlors, and the older guards asked her to pray with them when their private sorrows grew unbearable. Yet for all this attentiveness she gave to others, she kept a portion for the house itself, observing its seasons the way fishermen observe currents, because the mansion had moods. On some afternoons it tightened in on itself, the way a fist tightens around a rosary. On some nights it exhaled as if someone had just lifted a heavy confession off its chest. On certain mornings, especially after the chief returned from a trip up country or abroad, the chandeliers hummed a little harder, and the televisions in the guard post glowed brighter, and the flowers in the front hall gave off a breath that had nothing to do with their perfume. She noticed these things because to survive in a rich man's house, you had to read the air before it read you, and because once, early on, she had made the error of imagining that rules were written only on paper. Of all the rules that wrapped the compound like invisible wire, none was repeated more often, and with more theater, than the one about the attic. Staff were to clean the stairs but never ascend. The door was to be dusted but never opened. The key, it was said, had no duplicate. The space, it was insisted, was only a storage for items that had no use, and so needed no visitors. This was what the old housekeeper told new hires in the pantry where the ceiling fan ticked like a skeptical tongue. This was what the guards repeated to one another on the night shift whenever a new man suggested they take a stroll upstairs to relieve boredom. This was what even the head butler obeyed, though he knew which brand of whiskey the chief preferred after midnight and which of the two study lamps the man considered unlucky. Adaz cleaned the steps to the attic every other Thursday, and in time the rhythm of that cleaning became something like a prayer, her hand moving along the banister while her eyes measured the narrow window at the landing and the cobweb where no spider ever worked, the door at the top with its paint unchipped and its lock ungreased, and the faint discoloration along the threshold as if feet, many feet once upon a time, had hurried across with muddy urgency, and then never returned. When the dynasty celebrated, the house swallowed noise and did not complain. When the dynasty suffered, the house darkened its lights by a single shade and waited. When the dynasty negotiated, the house adjusted the temperature and the chairs and the lunch menu, as if these were matters of national interest. And always, beneath the visible movements, the invisible ones continued, the briefcases that entered with no record and exited with no signature, the lawyers who preferred to meet in the smaller study where the table had been built with a cavity that no one admitted existed, the pastors who prayed in pentameter, the banners of charity that were folded with military precision after cameras departed. Reputation here was not a mirror to be polished, it was a statue to be maintained, cracks filled, pigeons discouraged, rival monuments overshadowed by controlling the angle of the sun. And control, for the Adeyemi household, was not a policy but a liturgy. Everything that could be rehearsed was rehearsed, the way the chief's name would be announced to waiting guests, the sequence in which coats would be received, the order in which the fleet rolled out, the precise moment at which the chief would place a hand on a junior politician's shoulder so cameras would catch intimacy and hierarchy in one gesture. Control was the muscle memory of the place, and like all muscle memory, it was most visible when the body was under stress. Adedayo, who had been trained to withdraw her feelings from the scene the way a nurse withdraws a needle without scandalizing the patient, found that in this place it was not possible to be purely efficient, because the house required devotion as well as diligence, and so a tenderness grew in her for the things that people ignored, the tiny scorch mark on the far corner of the dining table where a candle, years ago, must have flinched, the hairline crack along the molding of the music room that looked like a river on a thin map, the greenish eye in the marble of the foyer that sometimes seemed to look back. She knew when Dan Lottie was about to lose his temper from the speed of his footsteps. She knew when Ijoma was preparing to make a speech because she rehearsed in front of the mirror and lifted her chin 1 degree higher. She knew when Cheek had spent his evening in the city, rather than the club, because he returned with a coat that smelled faintly of bookshops and diesel instead of cigars and jasmine. Cheik did not treat her as a tool. He said thank you and meant it. He asked about her father and remembered the answer. He did not look past her when he was speaking to her, and though it is a common mistake to confuse decency with destiny, there was about him a tenderness that the house could not discipline, and that made Adedayo's heart practice the dangerous craft of hope. From the terrace where the palms clacked their dry applause at the afternoon wind, she sometimes watched the water of the lagoon shiver under light, and imagined not a different life, but a life in which her work did not have to be performed with the posture of a ghost, a life in which her hands could be seen without being judged as hands that had no business touching certain things. And in those moments she felt for the house something that resembled pity, that such a beautiful, balanced, commanding space should have to live on the diet of concealment, the way an athlete might live on a diet of steroids. And she wondered what it would sound like if the house could exhale the entire story at once, not the approved version with its gallery of photographs and plaques and official gifts from overseas, but the full inventory, the favors called in, the oaths broken, the departures that no one mourned publicly, because mourning would have required explanation. The attic, in these daydreams, became a bell at the top of a church that no one rang anymore, because the last time it was rung, the city had woken not to worship but to judgment. She told herself she would never go up, that curiosity is a byword for ruin, that secrets which did not migrate down the stairs were not seeking her, and so she must not go seeking them. And she kept this discipline in the same way she kept the linen closet immaculate, with a care that earned her no praise, because praise is the first thing any house like this learns to ration. Yet the house had a way of leaning nearer when it wanted something. The ceilings seemed lower by a finger width, the lamps seemed an inch warmer, the clocks all appeared to agree in a manner that felt conspiratorial, and on such days the staff walked faster without being ordered, and the drivers polished the same spot again, and the gardeners clipped what did not need clipping, and the head butler checked the silver before an inspection that had not been announced. And it was on an evening like this, with the oxygen of the rooms feeling unusually disciplined and the parlor piano silent as if it were keeping vigil, that Adedayo, having finished the wine glasses and stacked them with the elegance of dominoes that promised not to fall, climbed the stairs to the first landing to dust the portrait of the chief's father, and from there, carrying the cloth and the bottle of spray and the humility that is the key to any long service, she ascended the smaller staircase to tend the narrow corridor, the one that led to the hush at the top where the forbidden door stood like a witness who had learned to tell the truth by refusing to speak it. The corridor smelled faintly of cedar and the old perfume of a woman who once wore a particular sorrow. The window at the landing had gathered the last citrine light of evening into a cup she was reluctant to spill. The dust along the skirting board shimmered in suspended discipline as her cloth approached. And it was there, in that corridor where a ceiling beam had a knot that resembled a closed eye, that the house at last broke its composure and told her, not in words but in the simple mathematics of sound, that something above was moving where nothing ever moved. One night, Adedayo heard faint footsteps from above. The sound came from the attic that no one dared touch. The poorest eyes in the house were the sharpest, and they saw what the wealthy pretended not to see. Adaz had been born in a village where the road gave way to bush after a single mile, and where roofs leaked during rainy season in such predictable rhythms that children learned to sleep by counting the drops. Her father had been a schoolteacher who owned more chalk than shoes, and her mother sold gari and smoked fish to keep the family afloat. When her father fell ill and his medicines grew more expensive than the harvest could cover, Adaz left her final year of secondary school to work as a housemaid in the city. She had promised herself she would send enough money home to keep her siblings in class, and that promise had carried her through the bus ride into Lagos, through the recruitment office that smelled of desperation, and into the Adeyemi household where contracts were never written on paper but carved into your body through endless repetition of rules. Each morning she woke before the first cock crow to iron uniforms, sweep corridors, polish the long dining table until the wood shone like a still river, and lay out breakfast trays with eggs that had to be precisely soft, plantains browned to a shade that satisfied the chief's memory of his childhood, and tea leaves steeped exactly 4 minutes. Her footsteps had to be soft enough that chandeliers never trembled, her words measured enough that no one could call them disrespectful, her presence discreet enough that guests sometimes mistook her for part of the furniture. She was invisible by training, but invisibility is not the same as blindness. The poor are taught early to notice the mood in a market before a fight breaks out, the change in a teacher's cough before a hospital visit becomes inevitable, the tiny delay in the shopkeeper's hand that means he is short of change. And Adaz carried this instinct into the Adeyemi mansion. It was her eyes that first noticed the small things others missed. The curtain in the second-floor corridor swayed sometimes when no window was open. The dust on the attic stairs seemed unsettled even when she had cleaned it the day before. The kitchen staff swore they heard rats, but Adaz knew the difference between the scurry of claws and the measured weight of footsteps. At night, while other servants snored in the quarters, she sometimes lay awake on her narrow bunk and listened to faint thuds above her head, as if someone were dragging something heavy across a forbidden floor. Fear mixed with fascination in her chest. If the attic was only storage, why did it sound alive? The family themselves carried enough mysteries to fill an attic. Danladi, the eldest son, wore designer suits and a smile wide enough for business partners to mistake it for sincerity. Yet behind that smile was a constant hunger for power, his conversations thick with words like contracts, shares, and monopoly. His eyes often followed his father's hand across documents as though he could not wait to inherit more than just the Adeyemi name. Ijoma, the daughter, cloaked herself in charity. Photographers adored her ribbon cuttings, the press quoted her speeches about empowering women, yet servants whispered about the nights she returned from galas with eyes sharp from liquor and words that slashed at anyone too slow to bow. Chuik, the youngest, was different. He greeted drivers by name, shared small jokes with gardeners, and sometimes carried his own books instead of demanding a servant's arms. The house tried to mold him into another replica of his father, but Chike seemed stubbornly human, and in those rare moments when his eyes met Adaizi's, she sensed in him a compassion no amount of wealth could polish away. Her duties often placed her near him. She carried tea into the study while he read late into the night, stacked plates when he lingered at family meals long after his siblings had stormed out, and polished the piano when he practiced chords he never seemed to finish. He spoke little, but when he thanked her, his voice carried none of the superiority she heard from others. Adaz tried to hide her blushes behind lowered lashes, but her heart beat differently when he was near. In a house where servants were trained to look without being seen, their shared glances became tiny sparks, dangerous, unspoken, but undeniable. Among the servants, conversation often circled back to the attic. They called it cursed, claiming the previous housekeeper had vanished after stepping inside. One gardener swore he had once seen a light flicker through the tiny attic window at midnight. A cook told of hearing wails echoing down the stairs, only to be silenced by the chief's booming voice insisting the house was sound. To speak of it openly was to invite dismissal, so whispers were exchanged in low tones while pounding yam or scrubbing uniforms. Adaz listened, never contributing, but her imagination painted the forbidden room in colors both terrifying and magnetic. Her curiosity deepened with each passing night. She polished the banister leading up to the attic with extra care, her hands lingering on the smooth wood, wondering what lay beyond. She imagined trunks filled with jewels, documents capable of sinking politicians, or perhaps relics of the matriarch whose stern portrait still hung in the dining hall. Fear told her to ignore it, to keep her head down and her wages flowing, but another part of her, the part that had not yet surrendered to servitude, yearned to know. One morning, after a particularly tense breakfast, where Chief Adeyemi scolded Danladi for mishandling a contract and Ijoma stormed out in a silk gown that whispered arrogance with every step, Adai's was clearing. The dishes. Cheek entered the kitchen, absent-mindedly flipping a ring of keys in his hand. He reached for a book he had left on the counter, and without looking, placed the keychain beside the tray she carried. Adai's picked it up, intending to hand it back, but something froze her breath. Among the polished brass keys, one stood out, longer, older, darker, with teeth cut in a strange jagged pattern she had seen only once before. It was identical to the lock on the attic door. Then one morning, Cheek accidentally handed her a keychain. Among its keys, one strangely matched the attic padlock. Every mansion has a room it pretends doesn't exist. The attic was Chief Adeyemi's. Night in the Adeyemi mansion carried its own kind of weight. The corridors, so alive with servants' footsteps during the day, grew cavernous in silence. The chandeliers no longer glittered with pride, but seemed to crouch like watchful sentinels above the marble floors. Security lamps cast half shadows against the walls, distorting the faces of ancestors in portraits until their painted eyes appeared to glare at anyone foolish enough to walk after midnight. The mansion, which by day exhaled power, now inhaled suspicion, and into this atmosphere of cautious darkness, Adai's tiptoed with her breath caught inside her chest. The key weighed heavily in her pocket, though it was smaller than her thumb. She had kept it hidden since the morning Chike left it on the tray, a mistake so casual he had never noticed. Adai's had considered returning it, her conscience warning her that danger in this household did not forgive innocence. Yet the whispers about the attic gnawed at her sleep. She had been raised in a home where secrets were not kept in locked rooms but carried in stories, sung under moonlight, shared around fires. To live in a house with a forbidden door was to live with temptation. That night, after the servants had retired and the guards patrolled the outer compound, she tied a scarf around her head, pulled her wrapper tightly, and slipped out of her quarters. Her bare feet glided across the corridor, her hand brushing the wall as though to steady herself against the silence. Every creak of the wooden floor seemed amplified. Every tick of the grandfather clock echoed like a gavel. She paused often, pressing herself against the wall when she heard distant movement, the shuffle of guards changing posts, the sigh of a window unlatched by wind. In her ears, her heartbeat felt louder than footsteps. The second-floor corridor stretched long and endless, a river of polished wood glimmering with faint moonlight spilling through half-closed curtains. She clutched the key tighter, whispering a silent prayer to the God her mother always invoked before journeys. Guide me where eyes cannot see, hide me where danger cannot follow. At the top of the narrow staircase, the attic door loomed, exactly as it had every Thursday when she polished its surface with dusting. Cloths. Tonight it seemed taller, sterner, its wood grain like scars in old skin. She knelt, brought out the key, and slid it into the lock. For a moment she feared it would not fit, that she had been wrong, that her imagination had played tricks, but the teeth sank in perfectly. With a turn, the lock groaned, the sound scraping like a voice that had been silent too long. She froze, listening. No footsteps came, no voices stirred. She pushed. The door creaked open with a long, aching moan, and stale air gusted into her face. The attic smelled of dust and something older, something hidden too long from the world. Her small lantern revealed beams crisscrossing above, cobwebs hanging like forgotten veils, trunks stacked against the wall, and portraits leaning against the rafters. She lifted the lantern higher, and faces stared back at her, faces of Adeyemi ancestors whose eyes seemed sharper in the half-light than in any oil paint. One canvas had a tear running across the mouth, as though silencing the figure permanently. Old curtains, embroidered but moth-eaten, sagged from hooks. A grandfather clock without hands leaned against a beam. Broken furniture gathered in one corner, suggesting the family discarded its past the way it discarded staff who failed. Her footsteps disturbed the dust into small clouds. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the attic had been waiting for her. She wandered slowly, lantern quivering in her hand. Each shadow threatened to shift. A cracked mirror reflected her face but distorted it, splitting her expression into halves, one calm, one terrified. She felt the weight of silence pressing into her ears, the sensation of being observed, though no one stood there. The attic breathed around her, groaning in the beams, whispering through the cobwebs. Then her light caught something at the far end, not a broken chair or a pile of rugs, but a chest. It was massive, carved from dark wood that glistened faintly as if oiled. Strange markings snaked along its lid, patterns that looked less like decoration and more like symbols. It sat apart from the other objects, too deliberate to be discarded. Her breath hitched. She had grown up with folktales of boxes that should never be opened, of containers that carried curses or spirits. Yet her feet moved toward it, her curiosity stronger than her fear. The closer she drew, the more her lantern revealed. The carvings were unfamiliar, almost tribal but broken, sharp angles that resisted recognition. The lock was unlike any she had seen. No keyhole, no latch, only a metal clasp fused into the wood. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. She felt as though she stood on the edge of a cliff, one push away from discovery or destruction. The silence in the attic thickened. The portraits behind her seemed to lean closer. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to flee back to the safety of invisibility. But another part of her, the part that had left her village to save her family, the part that had endured years of obedience without protest, told her this was the moment her life would change. She extended her hand. As her hand brushed the chest, she heard footsteps approaching the attic door. Some locks are not made for keys, they are made for sacrifice. The footsteps outside the attic door grew louder, heavy boots pressing against the wooden landing. Adaizi's chest tightened. She extinguished her lantern in a hurried breath, plunging the attic into darkness so complete that her pulse became the only sound she trusted. She crouched behind a stack of moth-eaten drapes, clutching the hem to her mouth so that even her breathing would not betray her. The door creaked open slightly, just enough for a sliver of light to slice across the dusty floorboards. A guard's silhouette hovered there, pausing as though listening for what he could not see. His torch swept once across the stairs but did not enter. For a moment, Adaiz imagined him stepping inside, catching her crouched in forbidden territory, dragging her down to the chief's study where explanations would fail before his suspicion. But the guard sniffed, muttered something about rats, and pulled the door shut. The lock clicked. His footsteps retreated down the stairs until the silence returned. Adaizi's body shook as she relit the lantern, her fingers trembling against the match. The attic seemed to breathe again, shadows easing back into their corners. She turned toward the chest, still looming in the far corner as if it had not been threatened by interruption. Her fear wrestled with curiosity. If she left now, she could still claim ignorance, but something stronger than obedience kept her rooted to the spot. She approached it slowly, her lantern illuminating the bizarre carvings that twisted across its surface like veins of some ancient tree. She ran her fingers along the lid, searching for an opening, a latch, even a simple hinge. There was nothing ordinary about it, no obvious place to insert a key, no clasp she could pry with the edge of a spoon. The grooves in the wood seemed to form patterns that made no sense, shifting like riddles she could not decode. She pushed at the lid. It did not move. She tapped along the edges, listening for a hollow sound. The chest sat immovable, as though the weight of generations held it closed. Her heart pounded with frustration. She remembered the tales told in her village, of shrines sealed not with locks but with curses, of containers that would never open unless the spirits themselves gave permission. A bead of sweat slid down her temple as she tried again, this time wedging a rusted nail she had found among the debris into the groove. She pried, pressed, even struck it lightly with her palm, but the chest remained stubborn. Her breath came heavy, dust filling her lungs. As she leaned closer, her hand slipped against the sharp edge of the metal clasp. Pain lanced her finger. She gasped softly, seeing the small bead of blood swell against her skin. Before she could wipe it away, the droplet fell, striking one of the carved grooves on the chest. She froze, horrified and fascinated at once. The wood pulsed faintly where the blood touched, as though the chest itself had inhaled. A faint vibration stirred beneath her palm. The grooves glowed faintly, absorbing the scarlet stain until the marks shimmered like veins lit from within. A low groan rose from the chest, a sound not mechanical but alive, like a creature waking after long slumber. Adedayo staggered back, lantern jerking in her hand. The air thickened, pressing against her ears. Slowly, agonizingly, the chest shifted. Its lid rose with the resistance of a coffin dragged open after centuries, the creak echoing through the attic like a lament. She bit her lip, torn between running and witnessing. Dust exploded upward, choking the air with the musk of age. She coughed, shielding her nose with her sleeve. When the dust settled, her lantern revealed what lay inside. No gold, no jewels, no weapons, only paper. Bundles of letters tied together with thick red wax seals, their edges browned with time. Each packet seemed to pulse faintly under the light, as though the words trapped within were desperate to be heard. Adedayo's fear collided with disappointment, then with suspicion. Why guard letters with such secrecy? Why demand blood to open a chest of paper? She reached forward, her hand trembling. The wax bore symbols unfamiliar to her, an insignia of the Adeyemi crest twisted into shapes she had never seen in public. She touched the first packet. Cold surged through her fingertips, racing up her arm as though the ink itself carried the memory of those who had written it. Her lantern flickered, shadows leaping across the portraits stacked nearby. The house seemed to lean closer, listening. She hesitated, her body taut with dread. To break the seal was to cross a line she could never return from, yet to walk away now would mean a life consumed by unanswered questions. Her hand shook as she slipped her nail beneath the wax. The seal cracked with a sound far too loud for paper, echoing in the attic as if walls themselves objected. Her trembling fingers broke the first seal. What she read made her knees weaken. Some letters are written to pass love, others to pass judgment from the grave. The wax cracked apart in Adedayo's hands, and the sound seemed to ripple through the attic like a shot. She unfolded the brittle paper with care, afraid that one wrong movement would cause it to crumble into dust. The handwriting that stretched across the page was elegant but heavy, letters written with the deliberate patience of a woman who had carried secrets too heavy for her shoulders but refused to die with them unspoken. The opening line stiffened Adedayo's breath. To whomever dares to read this, I write not for mercy, but for truth. The name beneath it, Lady Ifeoma Adeyemi, sent a chill down Adedayo's spine. The matriarch. The woman whose stern portrait still watched over the dining hall, whose eyes in oil paint seemed to command silence. Lady Ifeoma had died years before Adedayo entered the mansion, but her presence had never faded. The chief often mentioned her in tones of reverence, painting her as the quiet strength behind his empire. Yet here, in her own words, she revealed another face, one unseen, one untold. The letter began as a confession. She wrote of her early years beside Chief Adeyemi when the dynasty was young, when money flowed not from hard work or innovation, but from carefully orchestrated fraud. Contracts meant for public housing diverted into shell companies, tenders awarded to ghost firms that returned their profits to the family. Politicians bought with envelopes, judges purchased with favors, rivals crushed under the weight of bribes too large to refuse. The words sliced into Adedayo's heart like a blade. The mansion she had polished until her reflection gleamed in its floors was not built on dignity, but on deceit. The letter grew darker. Lady Ifeoma wrote of a man, a political opponent who had refused to bow to Chief Adeyemi's growing empire. His voice threatened to expose the fraud that funded their rise. She described the night of his death, a staged accident along the Third Mainland Bridge, but she insisted it had not been fate nor misfortune. It had been arranged, blood spilled by the dynasty to protect its claim. She admitted her complicity. She had remained silent, had even hosted guests the following day, had smiled through dinners while a family somewhere else mourned. Her pen seemed to tremble on the page, as though each stroke cost her more than the last. Then came a revelation that made Ada's grip the page so tightly her knuckles whitened. The Adeyemi inheritance, so fiercely guarded, had once belonged to another branch of the family. A brother, Chief Adeyemi's blood, had been deliberately erased. Lady Ifeoma wrote of a child, born to that brother, who by rights should have inherited part of the empire. But Chief had maneuvered to seize it all, casting the child into shadow, making sure his name never appeared on documents, never in records, never in the family's public memory. "He lives," she wrote, "though the world pretends he does not. If truth is ever told, this dynasty will split like wood under fire." Adazi's hands shook. A hidden heir? Erased by the very man whose name was carved above the mansion gates? She looked around the attic, at the faces of ancestors glaring from their dusty portraits, and for the first time she felt the house itself recoil, ashamed of the blood that fed its foundations. The empire she had once regarded with awe was nothing but a mask painted over betrayal. Her breath came ragged as she lowered the page. A flood of memories washed through her, the chief's voice booming with authority, Ijoma's charity speeches, Danladi's rehearsed smiles, the endless parade of guests who bowed before the family name. All of it, she now realized, was rotten at its core. Fraud, bribery, murder, betrayal. This was the true inheritance of the Adeyemi dynasty. Adaz staggered back from the chest, the letter trembling in her grip. She pressed it to her chest as if to steady her own racing heart. What was she to do with such knowledge? If she burned the letter, she would return to her life of invisibility, polishing silver and carrying trays, pretending not to hear the whispers in the walls. If she revealed it, she could destroy the family, perhaps even endanger herself. Cheek's face flashed in her mind. Kind, gentle Chike, the only member of the dynasty who had ever treated her as human. To expose his father was to destroy him too. Her knees weakened, and she sank onto an old chair covered in cobwebs. The attic pressed in on her, suffocating, as though the very air demanded she decide. She thought of her family back in the village. Her father's fragile health, her siblings' futures depended on her wages. To risk her position was to risk their survival. Yet to bury the truth was to chain herself forever to a lie. She closed her eyes, but the words from the letter burned into her memory. Adais realized she held in her hands not paper, but a weapon. And the moment she chose to use it, the Adeyemi dynasty would bleed. The most dangerous war is not between families. It is within one heart. Adaz did not sleep the night she found the letter. Her body lay on her narrow mattress, but her mind refused rest. Every time she closed her eyes, the matriarch's handwriting burned in the dark, each word glowing like fire carved into her skin. Fraud, bribery, murder, a hidden heir. She could still feel the paper's brittle texture against her fingertips, could still hear the dry crack of the wax seal. By dawn, she made a decision, not of courage, but of survival. She slid the folded letter beneath her mattress, smoothing the fabric above it until no trace remained. It was safer there than in the attic. If discovered, she could claim ignorance. Yet the hiding place offered no peace. Each time she lay down, she felt as though her back pressed against the truth itself. Her days carried on with mechanical routine. Trays carried, corridors polished, linens folded, glasses stacked. But inside, she was hollowed out, a vessel of secrets. The knowledge she bore was too heavy to carry, yet too dangerous to release. Every glance at Chief Adeyemi turned her stomach, his booming laughter at the breakfast table, his proclamations about loyalty, his carefully staged tenderness toward his children. She wanted to shout at him, to throw the letter at his feet and watch the empire crumble. But then she saw Chike. Cheek's kindness had always been a quiet flame in the coldness of the mansion. In the weeks following her discovery, that flame grew brighter. He lingered longer when she brought tea. He noticed when her hands trembled and asked if she was unwell. Once, when she stumbled in the corridor carrying too many plates, he reached out and steadied her, his hand warm against her wrist, his eyes filled not with entitlement, but with concern. In that moment, her heart betrayed her. The dynasty might have been rotten, but Chike was not. He was the single flower that had bloomed through cracks in the stone. The conflict inside her deepened. If she revealed the letter, Cheek's world would collapse. Everything he believed about his father, his family, his name would be shattered. Yet if she kept silent, she condemned herself to complicity. She found herself rehearsing conversations with him in her head. Chike, your father's wealth is stained. Chike, the man you trust hides blood on his hands. But when she imagined his face, she faltered. Would he hate her for knowing? Would he call her a liar, an enemy planted to destroy his family? Or would he believe her? And if he did, what destruction would follow? Even as she struggled, the mansion reminded her that secrets had their own way of stirring. One evening, when she stole back to the attic, the chest was gone. The dust along the floorboards told the story. Heavy grooves leading toward the door, faint scuffs of shoes. Someone had moved it. Adai's pulse quickened. Had the chief discovered her intrusion? Or had another pair of eyes found the letters? The attic felt stripped, hollowed, as though the air itself grieved the absence of its burden. She pressed her palms to the empty floor where the chest had rested, but there was nothing left but the memory of its weight. The disappearance ignited new whispers among the servants. In the kitchen, they exchanged nervous glances, murmuring that the chief had ordered a search. "He suspects theft," one cook whispered while chopping onions, her knife trembling with each slice. The guards prowled with greater vigilance. Rooms were searched under the guise of inspection. Even the staff quarters did not escape their attention. Adai's hands grew clammy each time a guard walked past her bunk. She prayed no one thought to feel beneath her mattress, where the thin fabric barely disguised the letter's presence. Her heart grew more divided with each passing day. Fear gnawed at one side, fear of exposure, of punishment, of her family back in the village suffering if she lost her wages. Love gnawed at the other, love for a man whose very name carried the weight of betrayal he did not yet know. Sometimes she found herself staring at Cheeky across a crowded room, wanting to run to him, to confess everything, to beg him to leave before the rot of his father's empire consumed him. Other times, she reminded herself that silence was her only protection, that the truth in her hands was less a gift than a curse. The mansion seemed to tighten its grip on her. The portraits in the halls looked more accusing. The chandeliers seemed to hum with disapproval. Even the air felt sharper, as though cutting her each time she breathed. She was no longer invisible. She was marked, if not by the chief, then by fate itself. The war within her heart grew unbearable. She would kneel at night, whispering prayers to a God who seemed distant. "Show me what to do," she begged. But no answer came, only the silence of walls that had heard too many secrets. Then, one morning, as she carried breakfast trays toward the dining hall, a guard approached with stiff precision. "The chief wants to see you," he said flatly. Her hands trembled so badly that the teacups rattled on the tray. The guard's eyes lingered on her, offering no clue of mercy. The next morning, Adai's was summoned to Chief Adeyemi's private study. Behind every billionaire's smile is a blade waiting for betrayal. The chief's private study was a room unlike any other in the Adeyemi mansion. Its walls were lined with books bound in leather, their spines gleaming like trophies, though Adai suspected few had been opened. The scent of polished mahogany and expensive cigars lingered in the air, wrapping itself around the furniture like a claim of ownership. Heavy drapes muted the light from outside, leaving the room in a twilight haze even in the morning. At the center stood a desk too wide for mere paperwork, a desk that looked built to remind anyone sitting before it that they were small, replaceable, and insignificant. Adai stood just inside the doorway, her knees weak, her tray trembling in her hands. The chief sat behind the desk in a snow-white agbada, its folds crisp as if ironed by heaven itself. His face bore a smile, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes, a smile sharpened by years of command, of sealing deals that ended men's careers with a handshake. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit, my daughter." She obeyed, though she dared not meet his eyes for long. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and then the chief leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the desk. "You have been here for years," he said in a tone that seemed almost affectionate, quiet, hard-working, loyal. "That is why I kept you. In this house, loyalty is the first law. Without it, Nothing stands. Not family, not business, not even life. His smile widened, but it felt colder than before. And when loyalty is broken, betrayal must be answered. Without mercy, Adaisy's throat tightened. His words felt like knives coated in honey, sweet on the surface but deadly beneath. She lowered her eyes, afraid that the turmoil in her heart might betray her if he looked too closely. The letter beneath her mattress seemed to burn hotter, as though even in its hiding place it screamed of treachery. The chief's gaze lingered on her, as though he were reading a confession on her face. She clenched her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. She thought of the matriarch's handwriting, of the accusations written in ink, of the hidden heir erased from history. She thought of Chike, gentle Chike, who would never withstand the destruction those words could bring. The silence pressed harder until she feared she might break and spill everything. But she remembered her mother's voice from the village. A secret carried in silence is lighter than a secret carried in fear. She swallowed, steadying her breath, and answered softly, "I've always been loyal, sir." The chief leaned back, his eyes narrowing. For a heartbeat, the air grew unbearable. Then he chuckled, though there was no mirth in it. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way." He waved his hand dismissively, as though swatting away an insect. "Go now. Serve the family as you always have. And remember, Adais, this house has no place for betrayal, not even in thought." She rose shakily and bowed her head before leaving the study. The corridor outside felt cooler, but her body was still on fire. She could not tell if he suspected her or if the speech was merely a warning meant for everyone. Either way, she knew the chief was not a man who spoke idly. His words were traps. Once spoken, they lingered, waiting for someone to stumble. Later that day, Cheek found her in the kitchen. His eyes lingered on her longer than usual, his brow furrowed. He said nothing about the study, but she could see in his expression that he sensed something had passed between her and his father. He wanted to ask, yet perhaps feared the answer. She longed to tell him, to pour everything out, to beg him to run while he still could. But she bit her tongue. Meanwhile, the family itself began to fracture more openly. In the dining hall, conversations grew sharp. Dan Ladi accused Ijoma of wasting money on charity events that brought no profit. Ijoma retorted that Dan Ladi had been reckless with procurement contracts. The chief tried to smile through it all, insisting the dynasty was unshakable, but his children's voices grew louder, their disputes rawer, each of them seeing not siblings, but competitors. Servants whispered in corners that the Adeyemi Empire was beginning to crack, its surface too polished to hide the fractures beneath. Adais felt the weight of the secret she carried pressing harder with every quarrel, every sharp glance exchanged at the table. She had not destroyed the dynasty, yet, but she could feel the edges of ruin creeping closer. That night, exhausted, she returned to the staff quarters. She slid onto her bunk, her body heavy with dread, but sleep did not come. The room was too quiet, the air too still. She turned on her side, staring at the wall. Then her eyes caught something at the floor. A folded paper slipped just beneath her door. Her blood froze. She picked it up with trembling fingers, unfolding the page slowly. In neat, deliberate handwriting, a single line glared back at her. "I know what you found." That night, Adais found a folded paper slipped under her door. "I know what you found." The walls of the mansion had ears, and now they whispered her name. From the moment Adais found the folded note beneath her door, the rhythm of her life inside the Adeyemi mansion changed. The walls that once merely observed now seemed to lean closer, recording every movement. The air that once carried the fragrance of polish and food now tasted of suspicion. She no longer moved as a maid whose presence was forgotten. She moved as a marked figure, a shadow tracked by other shadows. The guards were the first to change. Where once they had nodded casually when she passed with trays or linens, they now followed her with their eyes. When she crossed the corridor with dishes, one walked behind her until she set them down, as though her hands might conceal contraband. When she left the laundry with folded sheets, another lingered at the doorway, watching her return each bundle to its rightful room. Even her early morning duties, dusting the staircases before dawn, polishing the banisters before the family stirred, were no longer solitary. A guard often appeared at the end of the hall, leaning against the wall with the indifference of a man who was pretending not to monitor. Their presence was not announced, but it was deliberate. She had become an object of surveillance. The servants, too, shifted. Conversations that once flowed freely in the kitchen now dried up when she entered. Whispers that once included her now bent away, breaking mid-sentence, eyes sliding elsewhere. She caught them watching her with unease, the kind of fear people reserve for those who carry a curse. They had not seen the letter she hid beneath her mattress, but perhaps they sensed it, the way animals sense fire before smoke rises. A cook avoided her gaze entirely. The younger maid, who once shared gossip with her late at night, now pulled her blanket tight and turned her back as though even words exchanged with Adayo might condemn her. Chiki was different. His eyes followed her, not with suspicion, but with worry. One afternoon he found her alone in the garden, trimming the overgrown hedges near the back wall. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Adayo," he said, "something is troubling you." She kept her hands busy, clipping leaves that did not need clipping, hoping her silence might dissolve his question, but he stepped closer, his gaze gentle. "I know my father spoke to you. I saw the way you left his study. You've been different since then. Tell me, what is it?" Her throat tightened. For a moment she considered telling him everything, the matriarch's letter, the fraud, the blood, the hidden heir. It sat on her tongue, trembling, ready to spill. His eyes made it harder. They were honest, kind, a mirror of the trust she had craved in this house of pretenses. She wanted him to carry the secret with her, to share the weight. But she saw in her mind how the truth would shatter him, how it would carve away the last innocence he carried, how it might even turn his compassion into anger, anger at her for revealing it. She shook her head faintly, lowering her eyes. "Nothing, sir. I'm only tired." He did not believe her. She could feel it in his silence, in the way he lingered, in the sadness that clouded his face. But he respected her refusal and turned away, though not without a final glance that made her heart ache. As days stretched into nights, her fear thickened. One evening, she returned to the staff quarters and froze. Her mattress was askew, not the way she had left it. The blanket was folded incorrectly, as though careless hands had remade the bed. She pulled it back quickly, dread crawling through her veins. The letter, still there, pressed against the wooden slats. Relief surged, but it was poisoned by the realization someone had searched her room. Her belongings had been handled. Her small wooden comb was out of place. Her rosary beads were tangled, not in the neat coil she always left them. Even the jar of palm oil she kept hidden for her skin had been opened and resealed. Someone had been here, someone who did not care to hide their intrusion. It was not simply a search, it was a warning. That night she barely slept. Each creak of the quarters seemed like footsteps, each gust of wind a whisper at her ear. By dawn, her exhaustion was heavier than the trays she carried. Yet she forced herself through routine, because in this house, to falter was to draw more suspicion. The final blow came when she returned to her bed one evening and reached beneath the mattress with the desperate need to touch the letter, to feel the brittle paper that bound her fate. Her hand met only air. She searched frantically, tearing the blanket aside, lifting the thin mattress fully. Nothing. Her heart lurched into her throat. The letter was gone. She fell to her knees, trembling, her breath shallow. Someone had not only searched her room, they had taken what she had hidden. A piece of the truth now belonged to another, an unseen hand in the shadows. Her secret was no longer hers alone. Among her belongings, she discovers a missing letter. Someone else now holds a piece of the truth. In the darkest rooms, love can either be a shield or a trap. The day after Adayo discovered her missing letter, the mansion no longer felt like a place she worked. It felt like a cage that was slowly closing its bars around her. Every glance from a guard was sharper, every silence among the servants heavier, every passing moment with Chike more dangerous. The weight of what she carried, and what she had already lost, pressed so hard against her chest that she often found herself pausing in empty corridors just to breathe. Yet fate, in its cruel precision, did not give her the luxury of silence for long. That evening, As dusk wrapped the mansion in amber light, Cheek found her alone in the laundry room. She was folding linens, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes distracted, when he stepped in and closed the door softly behind him. His expression was not one of curiosity this time, but of resolve. "A daze," he said, his voice low but steady. "I can't keep quiet anymore." She froze, a sheet clenched tightly in her fingers. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart quake. "I know you're hiding something. But before you tell me what it is, you need to know something from me." He swallowed, his composure breaking for a moment. "I love you, Adaz." The words struck her like a blow and a blessing at once. Love was the one thing she had never allowed herself to imagine within these walls. She had prayed for survival, for wages to keep her family alive, but never for affection, not from the son of the man whose name towered over the city. Yet here it was, spoken in a voice trembling with sincerity. Her knees felt weak. "Sir," she whispered, but he shook his head firmly. "No titles. No distance. I've watched you all these years, your strength, your kindness, the way you carry this house on your shoulders while everyone else pretends not to notice. You've become the only part of this place that feels honest." His hand brushed against hers, and she felt the warmth of his palm, an anchor in a storm that threatened to drown her. Tears pricked her eyes. She wanted to melt into his confession, to believe that love could be a shield strong enough to protect her from the secrets she carried. But the truth inside her clawed at her chest, demanding release. If she loved him, truly loved him, how could she let him live inside the lie his family had built? Yet if she told him, she might lose him forever, his trust, his affection, his fragile innocence. She turned away, folding the sheet with unnecessary force, her voice breaking. "You don't understand what you're saying. Your family would never allow this. They see me as nothing." He moved closer, his voice firm. "Then let them see nothing. I don't care about their permission, Adaz. I care about you." Her tears fell then, silent but heavy. She longed to tell him about the letters, about the blood that stained the empire he bore, about the hidden heir waiting in the shadows of their dynasty. The words danced on her tongue, but fear silenced them. Instead, she whispered, "You don't know the danger of loving me." He reached for her hand again, gripping it tightly. "Then let the danger come." "I will face it." Before she could answer, the sound of heavy boots thundered down the corridor. The door burst open, and 3 guards stormed in, their eyes cold, their hands rough. "We are searching this room," one barked. "Orders from the chief." Adazi's blood ran cold. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought they must hear it. The guards upturned baskets of laundry, shook out linens, searched beneath the shelves. One approached her bunk at the corner, lifting the thin mattress, his hands probing the slats beneath. Adaz's entire body went rigid, her throat closing around a scream she dared not release. Cheek stepped forward sharply. "Enough," he snapped, his voice filled with authority. "She is my responsibility. If you have orders, you deliver them through me." His tone brooked no argument. The guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. None of them wished to challenge the chief's son outright. Reluctantly, they lowered their hands, muttered apologies, and filed out, their boots striking the floor in frustrated rhythm. The room fell into silence, broken only by Adazi's ragged breathing. Cheeky turned to her, his expression fierce but tender. "You see? I won't let them harm you." She wanted to fall into his arms, to let his protection become her refuge, but something gnawed at her still. As she began to remake the bed, smoothing the blankets with shaking hands, her heart lurched. She reached beneath the mattress out of instinct, her fingers groping for the folded bundle of letters she had hidden. They met only emptiness. Panic shot through her veins. She lifted the mattress entirely, searching with frantic desperation. The letters were gone, again. Not all of them, but one more was missing. The bundle was thinner, the waxed folds fewer. Someone had stolen another piece of the truth, leaving her with a wound that deepened each time. Her hands fell limp at her sides, her eyes wide with horror. Cheek stepped closer, confused by her sudden paleness, but Adaz could not explain. She could only stare at the hollow space where the letter had once been, realizing that no amount of love, no shield of protection, could keep the secrets from slipping into the wrong hands. As the guards left, Adayo noticed one letter missing from her hidden stash. Blood denied is blood that eventually returns with vengeance. The night after the guards stormed her quarters, Adayo could not close her eyes. Her mind raced in restless circles, haunted by the theft of another letter. The bundle that had once been thick now felt fragile, its edges frayed with absence. Whoever had taken the missing pages held a fragment of truth, a fragment sharp enough to wound if wielded. She turned the remaining letters in her trembling hands, terrified yet compelled to know what further darkness they contained. Her lamp flickered, casting long shadows across the cramped servants' quarters as she broke another wax seal. This letter began differently, with no confession of fraud or murder, but with a name, one Adayo had never heard spoken in the mansion, though the surname matched the dynasty. Lady Ifeoma wrote with bitterness, sharpened by regret. This house stands on stolen ground. The one who should have carried the Adeyemi name was cast aside, erased from memory, exiled from inheritance, yet blood cannot be banished forever. The heir lives still, Adesi's. Pulse quickened as her eyes scanned line after line. The hidden heir was the son of Chief Adeyemi's younger brother, a man once respected in political circles, but destroyed when his land and contracts were seized by the chief. The brother had died young, rumors of illness covering whispers of betrayal. His child, a boy at the time, had been spirited away by sympathizers, his name altered, his lineage concealed. Lady Ifeoma admitted her complicity in the cover-up. She'd signed documents, bribed officials, rewritten family records to erase him. But, she wrote, you cannot silence blood. It will cry out, and if he learns who he is, this dynasty will fall. Adazi's hands shook. The matriarch had written not to preserve power, but to expose it, as though her conscience in old age demanded reckoning. She described the heir's features with haunting precision, tall, with the sharp jawline of the Adeyemi men, the same storm-dark eyes, the same slant of shoulders. She even mentioned a small scar above his left brow, inherited from a childhood fall before he vanished from family records. Adayo froze as memory struck. Months earlier, while serving at the gatehouse during one of the chief's late-night returns, she had glimpsed a man standing outside. He had not tried to enter. He had simply stood there, gazing up at the mansion with an expression heavy with longing and something darker, resentment perhaps. The guards had shooed him away, muttering that he was just another beggar loitering near wealth he could never touch. But Adayo remembered his face, the scar above the brow, the Adeyemi jawline. At the time she had dismissed it as coincidence. Now, with the matriarch's letter in her hand, she knew it had not been. Her chest tightened. The hidden heir was not a myth written in ink. He was flesh and blood, alive somewhere in Lagos, moving through the same city that bowed to the dynasty that disowned him. And she had seen him with her own eyes. The revelation spiraled through her mind with unbearable force. If this man ever learned the truth, the Adeyemi dynasty would fracture beyond repair. The wealth, the influence, the name, all of it would collapse under the weight of stolen inheritance, and in her hands lay the evidence strong enough to ignite the collapse. Yet what was she to do? Reveal him, protect him, or conceal him as the family had, to preserve her own survival? Every path led to ruin. If the chief discovered she held these letters, her life would be forfeit. If Chaik learned of the heir, his heart might break under the betrayal of his own blood. If the heir himself came forward, a storm would tear through Lagos, swallowing every Adeyemi in its flood. Adayo pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes burning with tears. The choice before her was unbearable: protect the man she loved or reveal the man who had been denied everything. The mansion itself seemed to sense her turmoil. At breakfast, the chief's smile was too wide, his words too sharp as he spoke of loyalty. Danladi scowled across the table at Ijoma, their bickering now a daily occurrence. Cheek's eyes, however, kept finding Adayo's, soft and searching, as though he could feel the storm in her heart even if he did not know its cause. Every detail of the house sharpened into menace: the guard's footsteps outside her quarters, the servant's whispers, the silence of the locked attic above. By evening, she could not shake the image of the man at the gate, his storm-dark eyes staring at the mansion that had rejected him. She replayed the memory again and again, the way his hands had been clenched, the tension in his posture, the scar that marked his brow. The matriarch's words echoed, "Blood cannot be banished forever." Her fear became prophecy sooner than she could imagine. The very next evening, that same man arrived at the mansion. Every empire has bones buried beneath its marble floors. The evening air in the mansion grew heavier each day, as if the very walls anticipated calamity. Adayo no longer moved through the house with the invisibility that had once been her armor. Her silence was not the silence of a maid anymore. It was the silence of a witness. Her heart trembled as she unfolded another letter from the bundle that had already stolen her sleep and left her spirit raw. The wax cracked like brittle bone, and the paper unfolded to reveal not confession, but indictment. An account of the dynasty's crimes so chilling that her pulse nearly faltered with each line. The matriarch's words described the empire not as a monument of wealth, but as a fortress built on corpses. She wrote of political rivals who had once stood tall in Lagos, men and women who had resisted the Adeyemi family's climb. Their names had been scrubbed from newspapers, their legacies erased. Lady Ifeoma wrote that these rivals had not merely been outmaneuvered, they had been silenced. One had been found in a hotel room, the report declaring heart failure, but she admitted money had changed hands to make poison vanish from the records. Another had been killed in a staged car crash on a wet night, the brakes of his vehicle tampered with by hands loyal to the dynasty. A third had disappeared altogether, her body never found, her foundation quietly absorbed by Ijoma's charitable empire. The details were merciless: bribes delivered in brown envelopes under the cover of night, contracts stolen through forged signatures, and even family friends betrayed when they grew too ambitious. Lady Ifeoma's voice on the page was not proud. It was weary, cracked with the weight of sins carried too long. Yet she wrote not to absolve herself, but to make sure the truth could not be buried with her bones. "This wealth was never clean," she scrawled. "It was baptized in blood and corruption. If anyone dares to believe otherwise, let this record be my testimony." Adayo clutched the letter so tightly her knuckles whitened. The room spun with the enormity of what she now knew. How could she continue to sweep floors that had absorbed the echoes of murder? How could she polish silver that had been purchased with betrayal? Every glance at Chief Adeyemi now carried a weight that nearly crushed her. He laughed too loudly, dined too richly, and carried himself like a king. But kings, she now understood, often ruled with daggers hidden behind their crowns. Her moral crisis deepened. She thought of her father, frail in the village, relying on her wages to survive. She thought of her siblings, their schooling dependent on every naira she sent home. To reveal what she knew would not only destroy the dynasty, it might destroy her family's fragile survival. Yet to remain silent was to become an accomplice, a guardian of sins that did not belong to her. She prayed at night for guidance, but heaven remained silent, leaving her trapped in the storm of her own conscience. As if the letters themselves had poisoned the air, the family above her began to unravel more violently. Danladi and Ijoma, whose rivalry had long been barbed but contained, now erupted into open hostility. In the great dining hall, servants watched with wide eyes as Danladi slammed his fist against the table, accusing Ijoma of using charity to disguise theft. Ijoma's voice, sharp as a blade, cut back. She accused him of reckless greed that endangered their father's empire. Their words filled the room with venom, each syllable another crack in the family's facade of unity. Even Cheek, usually silent, looked stricken, caught between siblings who no longer saw themselves as kin but as enemies. The chief presided over it all, his face unreadable. At times his smile flickered, but it was a smile without warmth, a smile that seemed to weigh not affection, but strategy. He let them quarrel, let them bleed words against each other, as though their conflict were entertainment or a test. Yet Adayo could see the calculation in his eyes. He was not ignoring the storm. He was waiting for the moment to seize control of it. Adayo felt the tension coil tighter with each passing day. Guards whispered in corners, servants moved as though walking on glass, and the mansion itself seemed restless, its chandeliers humming faintly, its walls vibrating with secrets. She carried the letters against her chest, knowing they could ignite the final fire. And yet, she hesitated. She thought of Chaik, of his tender words in the laundry room, of his promise to face danger for her. How could she tell him that the danger was not coming? It was already here, written in the blood of his own family. The answer arrived sooner than she expected. One evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Chief Adeyemi rose from his chair at the head of the table. His voice carried across the hall, smooth and commanding, silencing even Danladi and Ijoma mid-argument. "Enough," he declared. "This house cannot continue to splinter. Tomorrow night we will settle all matters once and for all. A gathering, a reckoning. Let every voice be heard and every dispute be put to rest." His eyes swept across his children, across the servants, and lingered for the briefest moment on Adaeze. His smile was faint, but beneath it she sensed the edge of steel. Chief Adeyemi announced a grand family gathering to settle all matters once and for all. When a dynasty gathers, it is not for unity. It is for survival. The Adeyemi mansion had hosted countless banquets, but none like the one prepared for that night. The dining hall was transformed into a theater of grandeur, crystal chandeliers blazing with ruthless brilliance, polished marble floors reflecting every flicker of light, and a table stretched long enough to seat a minor parliament. Servants moved like clockwork, laying platters of steaming jollof, roasted goat, and imported wines as though food could soothe the venom already coursing through the family's veins. Guests from the city's upper crust arrived in sleek cars, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that they had been summoned not for celebration, but for spectacle. Chief Adeyemi entered last, dressed in flowing white agbada embroidered with threads that shimmered like rivers of gold. His presence demanded silence. At his right hand sat Danladi, stiff with self-importance. At his left, Ijoma, her jewelry clinking like chains. Cheek sat further down, his expression conflicted, as though he were present in body but not in spirit. And at the far end of the table, almost invisible among the glittering guests, Adaz stood with a tray, her hands steady though her heart thundered with secrets. The banquet began with laughter, brittle and forced. Speeches were made, toasts raised, yet beneath the gilded surface, the family's hostility simmered. Danladi's gaze darted across the table like a predator searching for weakness. Ijoma's smile curved too sharply, her words dripping with sarcasm. Even the chief's booming laugh rang hollow, as though it were armor against the unrest he could no longer contain. And then the doors opened. The hall fell silent as a man stepped inside, uninvited, unannounced. His presence sucked the air from the room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline unmistakably Adeyemi, and storm-dark eyes that scanned the table with the cold fury of one who had been denied for too long. Above his left brow ran a faint scar, the mark Adaiz remembered from that night at the gate. Her breath caught. The hidden air had returned, not in whispers of ink on paper, but in flesh and blood. Gasps rippled through the hall. Guests looked to one another in confusion, servants froze mid-step, and the chief's children stared as though seeing a ghost. Chief Adeyemi himself stiffened, though his smile never fully vanished. His voice, calm but edged, cut through the silence. "Who dares walk uninvited into my house?" The man's reply was thunder. "I am not uninvited. I am the blood you tried to erase." His eyes locked with the chief's. "I am the son of your brother, the rightful heir to what you stole." The hall erupted. Danladi sprang to his feet, shouting that the man was a fraud, an impostor. Ijoma demanded proof, her voice trembling with outrage and fear. Cheek remained seated, his face pale, his hands clenched against the table. Guests whispered in alarm, the air thick with scandal. Chief Adeyemi rose slowly, towering above them all. His smile had vanished now, replaced with the mask of a man forced to face a reckoning he had long buried. "You speak lies," he declared, his voice shaking the crystal on the table. "My brother's line died with him. There is no heir, but the man did not flinch. You can bury names. You can bribe officials. You can even kill those who resist, but you cannot bury blood. Look at me, Adeyemi. Look at your own reflection. The hall held its breath. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum louder, as though the house itself demanded witness. And then, like a match struck in a storm, attention turned to Adai's. A murmur began at one end of the table, swelling until it consumed the hall. "The maid knows," someone whispered. "She has been in the attic." The hidden heir's gaze turned, pinning her where she stood. His eyes burned with recognition, though they had never spoken. "She holds the truth," he said, his voice steady, unyielding. "She has the proof of everything this man has hidden." Adaz froze. Every eye in the hall turned toward her. The tray in her hands felt suddenly heavier than the secrets in her chest. Her breath came shallow, her heart pounding against her ribs as though trying to escape. Danladi snarled, pointing at her with accusation. "A servant dares meddle in family matters?" Ijoma hissed. "If she has touched anything forbidden, she should be punished." Cheek's voice broke through, softer but desperate. "A daze." His eyes pleaded with her, torn between fear for her safety and the gnawing need for truth. The chief's gaze was the sharpest of all, a blade hidden behind calm. "What nonsense is this?" he demanded. Yet Adaz saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of panic, quickly buried. She clutched the tray tighter, her lips trembling, her body paralyzed between silence and confession. The banquet hall, once a place of pomp and wealth, had become a court of judgment, and she stood at its center with every soul demanding a verdict. The hidden heir pointed directly at Adais. "She holds the proof. The higher a dynasty climbs, the harder it crashes." The silence that followed the hidden heir's accusation pressed down on the banquet hall like a storm cloud about to burst. Every guest, every servant, every family member held their breath, waiting for Adai's response. She stood frozen, tray trembling in her hands, her heart a drumbeat, echoing against the walls. For weeks she had buried the truth in silence, but now the weight of so many eyes, of so much expectation, crushed her into a decision she could no longer escape. Slowly, her trembling hand reached beneath her wrapper, pulling free the bundle of letters she had hidden closest to her heart. Gasps filled the hall. The chief's face darkened, a thunderous warning in his eyes, but Adaz no longer felt fear. The time for silence had ended. "This," she whispered, her voice breaking before rising with strength she had never known, "is the truth of this house." She laid the letters on the long dining table, the red wax cracked and broken, the matriarch's handwriting stark against the polished wood. Guests leaned forward, murmuring in shock as servants shifted uneasily. Danladi shouted for her to be silenced. Ijoma tried to snatch the bundle, but the hidden heir was faster. His hand slammed down on the letters, lifting them high for all to see. "Proof!" he thundered, "written by the chief's own wife. Fraud, murder, betrayal." The hall erupted. Political allies who had dined at the chief's table for decades now recoiled, whispers racing between them like fire through dry grass. A local senator rose abruptly, declaring he would not be part of such filth. A wealthy contractor slipped out of the room, his face pale, his loyalty severed in an instant. The chief's empire, so carefully polished, began to crack in real time, its power eroding not in secret backrooms, but in the open spectacle of scandal. The chief slammed his fist against the table, his voice booming. "Lies! Forged words, a conspiracy to destroy me." But his words rang hollow against the matriarch's delicate, damning script. Even his own children faltered. Danladi's outrage carried desperation, not certainty. Ijoma's eyes darted nervously between the guests, her smile faltering as whispers grew louder. Only Chaik looked stricken with grief, his gaze fixed on Adaz, with equal parts sorrow and admiration. Chaos surged. Security men who had long served the chief shifted uneasily. Some lowered their weapons, stepping back as though unwilling to defend a dynasty suddenly revealed as corrupt. Others whispered among themselves, calculating whether loyalty was worth the ruin that now loomed. Danladi pointed at Ijoma, his voice cracking with fury. "This is your fault. Your charities brought too much attention, too many questions." Ijoma fired back, her words sharp with venom. "No, brother, you squandered contracts, flaunted greed, drew the eyes of investigators. If anyone doomed us, It was you. Their voices clashed, louder and louder, until the hall felt less like a banquet and more like a battlefield. Guests fled in small groups, unwilling to be trapped in the collapse of a dynasty. Servants clung to walls, their eyes wide with terror at what had been unleashed. The hidden heir raised the letters again, his voice cutting through the din. This is the end of your empire, Adeyemi. The blood you spilled cries from these pages. You cannot silence it. And for the first time, Chief Adeyemi faltered. His face, once carved with confidence, seemed to sag under the weight of exposure. His eyes darted between his children, his guests, his allies slipping away like sand through his fingers. The wealth, the reputation, the fear he had commanded for decades, all of it trembled on the edge of collapse. Then the doors burst open. Men in plain suits entered, their badges flashing under the chandelier light. Authorities. The EFCC, investigators long whispered about but rarely seen in his halls, stepped forward with grim expressions. One of them spoke, his voice level. Chief Adeyemi, questions have been raised regarding your financial dealings. You are required to come with us. The hall descended further into pandemonium. Some allies tried to slip away unnoticed, others protested loudly, as though distance could shield them from the fallout. Danladi shouted that it was all lies, that his father would never fall. Ijoma screamed that the heir was a fraud, her voice shrill with panic. Amid the storm, Adedayo stood still, her hands empty now, her heart racing but unburdened. For the first time since she entered the mansion, she was no longer invisible. She was the fulcrum on which the dynasty turned, the maid who had carried the weight of secrets too long and finally set them free. The chief, towering even in his unraveling, stepped forward, his agbada swaying like the last proud flag of a conquered nation. His lips moved as though to shout another denial, but no words came. His chest heaved, his eyes glazed, and then, before the hall of witnesses, his body crumpled. Gasps cut through the chaos. Some shouted for a doctor, others stood frozen in disbelief. Cheik rushed forward, kneeling at his father's side, his hands trembling as he tried to lift the man who had once seemed unshakable. The chief's face was pale, his mouth slack, his heart, or perhaps his fear, finally broken. Chief Adeyemi collapsed at the center of the hall, whether from heart or from fear, no one could tell. Some letters destroy kingdoms, others release souls from chains. The Adeyemi mansion, once a fortress of intimidation, now stood abandoned and silent. Its great iron gates were chained, its walls stripped of power, its windows blinded by the heavy tape of government seals. The fountains had stopped running, the chandeliers were dark, and the polished marble floors where dignitaries once dined were covered in dust and the faint footprints of investigators. The empire that had ruled Lagos with money and fear was no more. Its fall had not come through rivals or politics, but through truth, fragile and unassuming, carried in the hands of a maid who had once been invisible. The EFCC worked quickly, freezing accounts, seizing vehicles, and locking away titles and documents that once passed untouchable. Politicians who had once raised glasses to the chief now denied knowing him. Contractors who had once begged for his favors vanished into silence. Newspapers filled their front pages with the scandal, printing the letters word for word, the matriarch's testimony now echoing far beyond the mansion's walls. The Adeyemi name, once gilded, was now a curse whispered with contempt. In the ruins of that downfall, Adedayo stood by Chika. He was broken, yet not in the way his siblings were. Danladi raged publicly, insisting the empire would rise again, but no one believed him. Ijoma wept for her reputation, not for the truth. Chake, however, carried grief not for wealth, but for the illusions that had defined his life. He saw clearly now what his father had built, what blood had been spilled to sustain it, and though the knowledge wounded him deeply, it also freed him. He turned to Ada's one quiet evening, as the last officials left the compound, and said softly, "All my life I thought wealth was a shield. But it was a cage. You gave me freedom, Adays, not the freedom of riches, but the freedom of truth." Her heart ached at his words. She had feared her revelations would destroy him, but instead, They had uncovered the part of him she had always loved, the man capable of choosing integrity over inheritance. When he asked her to leave the mansion with him, she did not hesitate. For the first time, her steps away from the Adeyemi estate were not those of a servant sent on errands or duties. They were the steps of a woman walking beside someone she loved, not behind him, not beneath him, but with him. The hidden heir, meanwhile, did not inherit wealth in the way the chief had hoarded it. The courts and authorities ensured that what remained was shared, debts paid, and corruption stripped bare. But he inherited something greater: recognition. For years he had lived as a shadow, denied his name, his place, his dignity. Now he stood in the open, not as a thief of power, but as its rightful claimant. His presence reminded Lagos that dynasties are not as invincible as they pretend, that stolen legacies eventually return to haunt the thieves who hoard them. For Adays, the story carried a deeper moral. She realized that she had not been cursed to discover the letters, nor punished by fate. She had been chosen. Out of all the servants, out of all the silent eyes in the mansion, it had been her hands that unlocked the chest, her blood that stirred its seal, her heart that bore the truth. She had been the vessel through which secrets found air, through which lies met justice. Her journey was not an accident. It was destiny. She thought often of her family in the village, of the father who would now rest easier with medicine provided by her wages, of the siblings who would grow up in a world where the name Adeyemi no longer silenced truth. Her sacrifice of silence had not been in vain. She had traded safety for honesty, invisibility for courage, and in doing so, she had freed not just herself, but many others who had lived under the shadow of corruption. One afternoon, as she and Chike walked hand in hand down a quiet Lagos street far from the sealed mansion, she paused and looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, she felt the sun without the weight of secrets clouding it. Her heart was light, her love was real, and her future, though uncertain, was hers to choose. Still, fate left her with one reminder of unfinished business. Among the ashes of the Adeyemi dynasty, when investigators cataloged the debris of the attic, they had found another sealed envelope, its wax untouched, its pages unread. It was handed to the authorities, logged into evidence, and locked away. Adays had not read it. She did not know what words it carried: another confession, another revelation, or perhaps a warning. As she walked away from the ruins of the mansion forever, she knew one truth with unshakable certainty: secrets never stay buried. Whether tomorrow or years from now, that last unopened letter would speak, and when it did, another story would begin. But among the ashes of the dynasty, one last unopened letter still remained. If this story moved you, don't just stop here. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next twist in our journey through power, love, and betrayal. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were Adaeze? And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, hit the like button and share it with a friend. Your support helps us bring more unforgettable tales straight to you.